Thank you, Ibrahim, everyone who put this together, my co-panelists. I have a difficult topic. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. I thought that perhaps one of the questions that lingers in people's minds is not the abstract question of whether or not Islam is compatible with democratic norms or freedom of speech, but why it is we see many of the conversations we see in the Muslim world or Muslim majority world. So I want to begin with two caveats. The first is the majority of the world's Muslims actually live in democracies. This is a common conceit whereby the Arab world is confused for the broader Muslim world, and a series of historical circumstances that produced the Middle East as we know it today is taken to represent all of the Islamic world. 50% of the world's Muslims live East Pakistan and East, meaning Islam is dominantly an Asian religion, and the majority of Muslims actually do not live neighboring Jewish and Christian communities, but Hindu and Buddhist communities. Again, these are topics that almost never go mentioned, but they are important to understanding Islam as it's perceived and as it actually exists on the ground. The second is there are no reasons to believe that Islam as a religion is incompatible with democracy. Because Islam does not project a certain political vision, there have been Muslims who in the past have articulated Islam's compatibility with monarchy, aristocracy, dictatorship, democracy, anarchy, and what have you. A religion that has been around for that long and has influenced that many societies will obviously have every kind of permutation you can imagine. What I want to talk about is why these conversations around the role of Islamic law and public religiosity and blasphemy laws, as we mentioned, exist in the Muslim world today. And fundamentally, they have to do with the fact that the majority of the Muslim world as we know it today, from Morocco to Indonesia, was governed broadly by a very similar kind of social construct, which was destroyed in the period of colonial rule and in the period of modernization, whether imposed from without or imposed from within. Therefore, the majority of the world's Muslims have experienced secularization not as an indigenous process, but as a dictatorial imposition from above that is seen as a challenge to local values and beliefs. Now, to understand the social construct and the social contract, I want to talk a little bit about how Islam developed authority. So in the year 632, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, dies, all of the Arabian Peninsula acknowledges him as prophet, right? So basically in the course of about 22 years of prophecy, for lack of a better term, all of the Arabian Peninsula is converted to Islam. When he dies, however, the overwhelming majority of Muslims believe there is no clear mandate for what is supposed to happen next. For the next few hundred years of Muslim history, you have two processes running in parallel, often butting heads, and sometimes breaking out into violence. These two processes are the development of the Caliphate, and I'll explain these terms, and the development of the ulama, or scholars. Basically, Muslims believe that the Quran is the word of God, and the Prophet Muhammad embodies the Quran. So if you want to know how to live the Quran, you look to the Prophet's life. After Muhammad dies, there's a rapid expansion of a caliphate, by which I mean a state governed by an individual who is supposed to be in charge of the entire Muslim community and represent the Muslim community. Very quickly, the caliphate becomes a monarchic dynastic office, right? So very quickly, it becomes just another dynasty. It has the trappings of Islam, but fundamentally it becomes a dynastic system whereby the king passes down power to the son, and so on and so forth. For about 100 to 150 years, the caliphate that exists is subject to repeated revolts, often by members of the Prophet's family and those persons who are originally closest to the Prophet. Most of these are put down violently. This begins a period of soul searching, where a number of Muslims begin to ask what the purpose of Islam was, and find in the caliphate not that, right? So they look at the caliphate and say whatever they're doing is not what we were supposed to be doing. So you begin to develop a class of scholars who basically master the sources of Islam, by which I mean the Quran and the life of the Prophet, and then through what is called Sufism or Tasawwuf, a discipline of purification, teach people how to embody that. Very similar to monastic orders. You all following me, basically? So you've got these two trends. You've got a caliphate, which is basically something like an empire, and you've got the development of, for lack of a better term, religious lawyers who are also chaplains, right? And they do not like each other, right? Because the caliphs would like to monopolize authority for themselves, right? Because ostensibly that's their job. And the scholars look at the caliphs as basically corrupt and degenerate. There's a famous saying of a Muslim scholar that says, you should prefer the opinion of a man you see drunk in the street, right? And alcohol is taboo in Islam, over the opinion of a scholar if you see him leaving a palace. Because that means he is a tool of power. And the only conditions under which most scholars believed you could speak to the ruler was if the ruler came to you. You never went to the ruler. You see what I'm saying? You preserved some measure of priority in the scheme of things. Now, what happens, and I'm going to do like 1,500 years of history in like 8 minutes, so this is going to be the worst lecture ever. And, you know, you can just hammer me afterwards. It's fine. Starting in the 11 and 1200s, you begin to get a series of invasions by our Central Asian friends. They seem to be very good at conquering things. With all due respect, my last name, you know, probably my family was kidnapped, and then to make ourselves feel better, we took the last name of one of the empires, and then, you know, we played it off later because it sounded cool. But it's okay. That actually didn't happen. I have no idea what happened. Like nobody knows what happened. I'm just making that up. For those of you who don't know what my last name refers to, you can just shut your brains off right now. These dynasties were basically Mongol Turkic dynasties. Conquered the majority of the Muslim world between 1100, 1200, 1300, 1400. Most of them were not Muslim, but many of them ended up converting to Islam, which, by the way, totally explodes, bad choice of words, the myth that Islam was spread by the sword. Because who exactly is going to force the person who just conquered you to convert is a question I don't know if anyone has actually proposed a serious answer to. And basically, they're the ones who come up with the social contract. Because if you're a conqueror and you have an army, what do you really want to do? Right? You probably want to keep conquering. Right? I don't know. I've never conquered anything, so I don't know, but I'm assuming, right? That's what you do. But how do you conquer things? You need an army. And what do you need to have an army? What do armies need? Money. Lots of money, which means you have to tax your inhabitants, right? But if you like to conquer things, you do not want to be an accountant. No offense to any accountants in the audience, right? But in the scholarly class, you have people who are literate, numerate, and have local roots and authority. And you basically get the equivalent of political secularism, not cultural secularism, where the scholarly class agrees to basically become the bureaucratic backbone of the state in exchange for certain privileges. And the ruling dynasties absorb the scholarly class and protect them and advance their interests, and it's kind of a marriage of convenience. But it works. And it manages to sustain empires that last for hundreds of years. So the Mughal Empire, for example, at its height in the 1600s, controlled something like 30% of the world's total economy. Right? So these were incredibly wealthy, sophisticated, and for the time, literate and cultured societies. However, they were pre-modern, they were not modern, the major difference being they're not centralized. And when these dynasties were confronted by centralized states which emerged in a corner of northwestern Europe, they all lost. Right? There is no part of the Muslim world that is pre-modern. This is a common conceit, a common myth. The Muslim world, generally speaking, like much of what we call the third world, was on the losing end of modernity. In fact, the idea of the third world literally comes from a transference of losing to some sort of genetic or inherent inferiority. So basically what this has done is it's ripped out the civil society that allowed these cultures to function and to flourish. And in the absence of these, you have basically had a free-for-all, because nobody has come up with a durable compromise for balancing cultural interests, religious identity, and political power. And this is further complicated by the fact that modernity and capitalism are relentless, right? They don't give anyone a break. So modernizing societies do not have the luxury of sitting around and asking themselves, well, what should we keep from our heritage and what should we discard? And let's have a 50-year democratic conversation. No, you need to modernize and industrialize rapidly or you will be conquered. So what you get is an evisceration of the whole structure. So what you're seeing in the Muslim world today, and this is a lot of the Muslim world, whether democratic societies or dictatorial, is a conversation over where are the boundaries between religion, ethnic identity, national identity, state power, so on and so forth. And these take on very different forms in very different contexts. but they have certain themes in common. And one of the themes, I want to throw this out to you as just a thought experiment, and then I'll end with it, is that the Muslim world is now emerging into a post-colonial period in which democratization is either being realized or debated or attempted. But the Muslim world has the misfortune of trying to democratize when the idea of universal franchise already exists. I'll give you an example. Most of the people in this room would not have been allowed to vote on the American Constitution. It's true. The American Constitution is not a particularly democratic document. It was produced by propertied, white, aristocratic males. And it was presumed to apply to the entirety of the territory given to the United States by the Treaty of Paris, right? Basically the Mississippi to the Atlantic seaboard. What many Muslim countries are trying to do right now is forge a durable social contract between people with very different visions of what it means to be a human being, right? We use the word human rights, but what happens if your conception of humanity is different from someone else's? Do you still have your human rights? Right? This is an open question. It's a challenge. If we had asked in 1787 every single inhabitant of the United States, male and female, free and slave, African American and white, Native American and of European ancestry, to vote on a constitution, what is the likelihood we would have had a constitution, and would have it resembled our constitution? And that really is the challenge that exists in the Muslim world today. This has nothing to do with Islam inherently. This has to do with the nature of how Islamic societies developed, the loss of a social construct and a social contract, at the same time a vision of what it means to be part of society, and an attempt to figure out what comes next. And actually, the rabbi mentioned very briefly an article in the New York Times, which hits the nail exactly on the head. It was back in the green room, where there's a stipulation in the Tunisian constitution, which is the only one that's come out of the Arab Spring with any legitimacy, that freedom of speech shall be protected, as well as respect for religion and the sacred, right, which appear to be at odds. Other than fueling, I think, many legal careers in the future of Tunisia, it is an attempt to balance two different visions of what it means to be part of a society. Every constitution needs some level of tension, otherwise it would brittle and fall apart, but too much tension and it doesn't forge compromise. This is really what we're beginning to see. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much.